Here's a question. Can we eliminate our need for cars? What alternatives exist? And can we maintain or improve our quality of life by adopting them? Annually, cars consume more than 500 billion gallons of gas and emit trillions of pounds of CO2. More than 250 billion pounds of materials are used to produce them each year, and nearly half of our cities are used for car transportation and parking. In this episode, we'll be joined by two guests, Peter Muller, president of the Advanced Transit Association and PRT Consulting, and Gary Sjoquist, advocacy director for the largest bike parts distributor in the world, Quality Bicycle Products, a $300 million company which has been pivotal in the bikeification of cities. Together, we will explore the viability of two types of alternative transportation, bikes and PRT, or personal rapid transit, and how they can reduce our dependency on cars and the infrastructure required to support them. My name is Alan Fine. Welcome to the Global Benefit Podcast, where we promote global wholeness by leading conversations toward the health, harmony, and security of the world. Media addiction is a major problem. Being responsible media creators, we recommend you take regular breaks from all media, including this show, to develop yourself and be an active participant in the world. Excessive media consumption will negatively impact your life, so please watch responsibly. Well, welcome, gentlemen. It's nice to have you here today. With regard to our global environment, what's interesting is, Peter, you're from Cape Town, South Africa originally. And
that's correct.
What's that?
That's correct.
Yeah, that's correct. And interestingly enough, they've just experienced something that most of our listeners wouldn't be aware of, and that is a major water shortage. It put tremendous restrictions on people there, but they were running out of a natural resource. We live in a world of finite resources. We're growing in population by 1 billion people every 12 years. There's some big challenges that we're facing in terms of being able to stretch these resources to accommodate a growing population. I'm wondering about your thoughts, Peter, on just that crisis, in essence, in Cape Town, South Africa, and its far-reaching impacts on the people living there, and the types of things we could be looking forward to in the future that could be similar to that.
Yeah, I was there in 2018 when Cape Town was a month or two away from shutting down all municipal water supply. That's how bad it was. It was horrendous. And the cause of it, as I understand it, was a combination of climate change and bad governance. The bad governance we can fix. The climate change is a little more difficult to fix. A big part of the reason why I'm a proponent of PRT is that I believe it goes a long way towards mitigating carbon emissions from transportation.
In relationship to that, Peter, you've talked about in the past too about how automobiles in essence emerged in society. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes, I just don't think that the so-called transportation system was ever systematically designed. It kind of just happened. We got cars and they just drove around the field, and then they made tracks, and so we kind of turned those tracks into roads and upgraded them, and then they got more cars and more roads, and then we had intersections and they didn't work. So we put in traffic signals, and I don't know about you, but it was just the other day, I was 4 cycled at a traffic signal. You know, they don't work either. So this whole so-called system of transportation that we have is horrendous. It's just kind of evolved over time, and it's never gotten better. It actually continuously gets worse. And we just make these improvements to try to mitigate how much worse it's getting. We've never solved it.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about in Los Angeles, for example, if you want to just go from LA to a suburb, it might be a 5-mile drive could take you hours to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And as a matter of fact, we'll see roads, for example, highways that are 15, 20 lanes or more on a side. I wonder how much land usage is used up just for cars in proportion to the total land available for cities.
Well, I think, again, communities are suddenly realizing, what happens when you put highways through and rips up communities. That's sort of growing awareness of that. But then also, I think the other realization is we can't build our way out of this. And so it's interesting, there was a concept called induced traffic that I became aware of early on in the work that I do, that where if you build more lanes, they just get filled. And so we see this in Atlanta, we see it in Los Angeles. Yeah, it's this progression that's happened, and it's really now we're at a point where it's like Band-Aid fixes on top of Band-Aid fixes, and trying to make any kind of long-term sustainable change is a huge task.
I noticed it was interesting, Peter, maybe you can speak to this with regard to China and the whole idea of PRT in China. I've seen that some of their major highways are incredibly wide and very congested. I think they might even make California's highway system pale by comparison in terms of the potential for congestion that we would see in China. You had spoken recently in, Zhejiang International, about their intelligent transportation
Yes,
an expo in 2018.
It was a huge conference. It was the biggest audience I've ever spoken to. There were over 1,000 people in the audience. And they were all very interested in not only personal rapid transit, but autonomous shuttles and all other kinds of new developments in transportation. The Chinese are realizing that they need to fix this problem. It's not just the congestion, but cities like Beijing have this huge pollution problem with smog and so on. And so they realize they need to fix it. And they're in the fortunate position, in some ways, that they have an authoritarian government that can decide to do something and then just do it. We in the US are stuck with a democratic government that makes it much, much more difficult for them to do anything, because whatever one party proposes, the other party tends to not want. And we're seeing the same problem in countries like India, where they're very democratic. And so just as a few people who are upset about the project can kill it. And then, of course, India on top of that has big problems with corruption. So it's very difficult to do PRT in India.
Why don't you tell us about PRT and what that is?
Okay. So I think maybe one way to start would be to think about the last time you were at a big airport and you rode the airport people mover or airport train, and what that experience was like. That's a driverless train that acts really just like a driven train, only it functions more efficiently because it's driverless. And it goes from station to station and stops at every station. So you take that concept of a driverless train and you say, okay, what can we do to make it better? Part of the problem with that train is that the individual trains can only travel as close as about 60 to 90 seconds to each other. So there's a limit on capacity because they can't get closer, because they have to be able to switch and go in different directions. And in order to switch, part of the guideway has to move. And then you have to be sure that that part is moved and locked. And then you have to be able to do that at such a time that the next train, if necessary, could stop before it hit that switch. When you add all those times together, you come up to 60 to 90 seconds. Well, in PRT, we took the switch out of the guideway and we put the switch in the vehicle. Now, two vehicles can follow very close behind, and the one can set its switch to go left, and the other one can set its switch to go right. And then when the two get with a different set of switches, when they get to the diverge, they just go apart, even though they're traveling very, very close together. So now you can have more capacity, which means you can also use smaller vehicles. And so we can have small vehicles traveling close together within a second or so of each other compared to 90 seconds. And the vehicles can have 4 or 6 passengers instead of 100 or 2, and you can actually have the same capacity, if not more. This also helps enable something called offline stations. So with the Airport People Mover, if you're going from concourse A to concourse C, you will stop at concourse B. With PRT, if you're going from A to C, you will bypass the station at B. So your trip, even though your maximum speed may be the same or even slower, your trip time is way less. So what PRT is then in a nutshell is small vehicles, typically 4, maybe 3 to 6 passengers with their luggage, typically able to accommodate bicycles and things like that also, wheelchairs. These small vehicles travel on fixed guideways like you see at the airport. So in other words, they're on guideways that are separated from other traffic. The way this is usually done is to elevate them up in the sky. So 15, 20 feet up, so they go over other traffic. They go over pedestrians. They never cross paths with cars or buses or trains or bicycles, pedestrians, and so on. This gives them 2 advantages. One is they're extremely reliable, and the other is they're extremely safe. PRT around the world has now done over 200 million injury-free passenger miles.
So does it cost more than light rail?
Okay, that's a good question. So when you make smaller vehicles, your cost per passenger for the vehicle actually doesn't go down. It's about the same as the cost per passenger for a bigger vehicle because you've got less weight, but anyway, for whatever reason, it's about the same. But what does go down in terms of cost is the cost of the guideway. And the cost of the guideway is over half the cost of the system. And with PRT, the loads on the columns on the guideway are about 10% of the loads on the columns of an elevated light rail. So when you compare PRT in general with light rail being elevated or at grade, the average cost of light rail compared to the average cost of PRT, light rail is about 4 times more expensive for capital costs. Now, when you look at operating costs as well, PRT needs no drivers, and that gives it a huge advantage in operating costs. So it's less expensive in terms of operating costs. When you put all of the costs together and you say, how much does PRT cost per passenger, average passenger on an average trip? And that cost for PRT is around, it depends on circumstances, but around $2 to $4, which is kind of the amount a passenger can expect to pay on light rail. With light rail, if you take the FTA, Federal Transit Administration's list of light rail projects that they're about to build, how much they cost and how many passengers they're going to carry and all that, and you figure out the true cost of light rail, the equivalent number is not $2 to $4, it's around about $20 per passenger for light rail. So that's a comparison. It's 10% of the overall costs, 10 to 20%, and it's about 25% of the capital costs.
So you could basically put in 4 times the amount of PRT infrastructure for the same price of what you're paying for light rail, plus it won't interfere with existing traffic from what you were saying.
Yes, exactly. But it's actually better than that, because when the costs come down so much, what happens is that provided you've got a big enough deployment of PRT and a dense enough population, it doesn't have to be very dense, PRT has the potential to pay for itself, not only its operating costs, which almost no public transit in the US pays its own operating costs, but it can also pay for the amortization of its capital costs. So here you have a system that can be introduced at no cost to the community and operate off of its own fare box revenues.
What about the economic savings associated with the savings of time for
Well,
passengers.
when you take all those benefits into account, the savings in time, the savings in pollution, climate change, safety, accidents, all those things, the benefit cost ratio of PRT is typically higher than 3 times, whereas for rail projects, they're typically above 1, but not above 3. And I've seen PRT projects where the benefit cost ratio is as high as 5 times, which is huge.
And what are the speeds that PRT is potentially could be used for in transportations through urban areas, for example?
So this is very interesting because people like to think in terms of top speed, and top speed is not the metric. The metric is average speed. So at present, PRT runs at average speeds between 15 and 20 miles an hour. Light rail runs at average speeds between about 10 and 20 miles an hour. So it's slower than PRT. The same for automated people movers. They run at speeds around 10 to 20 miles an hour. So even today, with today's slow PRT, it's faster than most of today's guideway-based transit. Now, you mentioned earlier the American Society of Civil Engineers Automated People Mover Standards, and we've just been involved in a 3-year-long effort to change those standards to get away from railroad-based standards that are a couple of 100 years old, and to come into the modern age and allow for driverless standards for PRT small vehicles that will potentially enable PRT to operate safely at up to 60 miles an hour and 1 second headways. This not only increases the average speed, but it also increases the capacity of the PRT system. And when you can increase the capacity, you effectively lower the cost per passenger.
In our last podcast, we spoke to Rick Harrison, who designs cities, neighborhoods. He was mentioning that the average development is around 250 homes at a single time, that in the United States each year we're building more than 1 million new homes every year, and that the largest project that he's done is 250,000 homes. It looks like there's lots of opportunity to develop, in essence, the world and the infrastructure of the future that hasn't been developed yet. So it seems like this could potentially be something that would be especially important for new development and then incorporating into existing infrastructure as well.
You're absolutely right. Now, in new development, you could do things totally differently, and you could use PRT for most of the transportation in the new development. You could have far less roads and almost no parking lots. You may have parking on the periphery for people's cars who have to then go elsewhere. You could do all these things and actually make a community that costs a whole lot less to build and operate than the way we do it now. There's a big problem with it, though, and that is if you're talking about a 250 home community, it's way too small to get these kind of benefits. It won't be practical. You need a large community before you can really do it that way.
So we're going to take a break for 5 minutes here, but we're going to talk about the pedestrian highway when we get back, and the innovations that have been happening with bikes. So we'll be back in 5 minutes. Welcome back. We're joined by Peter Muller, President of PRT Consulting, and Gary Sjoquist, Advocacy Director for Quality Bicycle Products. Gary, over the past 30 years, there's been a transformation, or I should say there's been an amazing innovation continuum in association with bicycles. When I was a kid, I had a 10-speed bike, and there was a 1-speed and a 10-speed. That was basically what there was. And most of us were young that were biking. Steve Flagg, the founder of Quality Bicycle Products, said that he never imagined that this company could become as big as it has based on where things were at that particular point in time. But there's been a tremendous evolution in association with innovations with bikes. And I'm wondering if you could speak towards what that evolution has been.
Certainly. Well, one of the challenges in the bike industry is that there's so much of a focus on racing and what I call the march of technology. Inevitably somebody invents something, and then the march is on to make it lighter or better, more efficient, cost less, that kind of a thing. In the 80s, mountain bikes became popular, and the march of technology took over with mountain biking, and a lot of that trickled down into road bikes. And then more recent.
How did that move into road bikes?
Well, things like smaller frame sizes and more comfortable seats and different kind of componentry. So we went from 10 speeds to 18 speeds or 24 speeds. Mountain biking, if you're going to be climbing mountains, you need very low gears, okay, which means big sprockets. And so any number of clip-in pedals, for example, borrowing suspension technology from the ski industry, where you actually clip into your pedal to be able to pull yourself, which is very helpful in mountain biking. And then that transferred into road riding or road racing, actually, and even down into commuting in some senses. So we've seen a lot of innovation that has been directed recently just toward commuting bicycles. And so lighter frames, wider tires, wider rims, low pressure tires that are more comfortable instead of a 115-pound tire, and frames that are more comfortable, so people aren't riding hunched over but are actually sitting more upright. It's a more comfortable position. And then, of course, all the new electronic, computers and electronic shifting and those kinds of things have really made commuting much easier than it used to be. That march of technology has had a lot to do with that, making the bikes lighter, more efficient, and easier for people to ride.
So I've also seen out of Quality Bicycle Products a series of new types of bikes that are operable under different types of conditions. Maybe you could speak towards, help us to understand just some different types of innovations there.
Yeah, well, certainly one of the innovations has been fat bikes, riding bikes in winter on snow, and again, a lot of that technology transferred over, being able to use studded tires to ride on ice, and now you can get commuter tires. You can have narrow tires that have studs too, so it makes it easier. We actually started a separate company to deal with the apparel effects, the kind of apparel you need to have for fat. It's called 45 North, and so bigger boots and bigger gloves and what are called pogies that essentially cover your handlebars, so you can run a smaller pair of glove in really cold weather when you're riding outside, which is very helpful for commuting too as well. Again, the march of technology, one of the cool things about QBP is that we have separate little companies. If you came to QBP, I could show you the Salsa World Headquarters or the Surly World Headquarters, and it's just a bunch of desks on a corner. But it's where all the engineering takes place. And so just like some of our engineers decided, wouldn't it be cool if we could ride bikes on snow? We developed that technology. And then a bunch of our engineers decided, wouldn't it be cool if as riding hard on roads has become more dangerous because of distracted driving, wouldn't it be cool if we could have big gravel rides where people would just get together and have a good time riding on gravel roads? There's an endless supply of gravel roads. So that's another new innovative category, gravel bikes, separate kinds of frames, separate kinds of tires and tubes, separate componentry, that kind of a thing. And right now that's the fastest growing part of the bicycle industry, is the gravel end of it. Probably the other one is e-bikes. So e-technology, applied pedal assist, to help basically extend your ability to ride.
Now, how is that different from a moped?
In bicycling, and actually it should have, we've had a problem with verbiage, and so instead of saying e-bike, we should be saying pedal assist. So in Minnesota, the way e-bikes are classified is you have to be able to pedal to actually get the electric assist to kick in, and then it kicks off at 20 miles an hour. So that's different than having a scooter that has a throttle operated that you don't have to pedal. And so that's been part of the challenge for the bike industry, is to get everybody else to understand these are not motorcycles, or not electric scooters. These are bicycles that are simply assisted by an electric motor. So,
and I noticed also there's some bike innovations with regard to the ability to function effectively with families.
Yeah. So again, our engineers came up with what was called the Big Dummy years ago, which is essentially a stretched version of a bike. I tell people it's like a station wagon for a bike. So as typically happens, some of our engineers are diehard commuters, and when you live by yourself, it's not a problem. But when you have a family and you have little kids, and you are dedicated to using your bike to get around, you have to bring your kid to school or go stop at the store to pick up a prescription or something like that. And so, again, our engineers designed a bike to be able to haul people and materials and this long frame that was actually very comfortable riding. And they're big and heavy, but you're not using them to go mountain biking or climbing big hills. It's mostly commuting kind of work on relatively flat terrain. And so the successor to the the Big Dummy is what's called the Big Easy, which is that version of a sort of a station wagon bike that has pedal assist. And so we see very often mom or dad riding a bike, and there'll be 2 or 3 little kids on a rack in the back, and there'll be panniers to hold groceries or beer or whatever, and they just ride everywhere with that method of getting around, and it's very efficient and fairly easy to ride too. You have to take into consideration the longer wheelbase, so going around corners, that kind of thing. But it's pretty easy. They're very flexible, easy to get used to.
So Quality Bicycle Products is trying to innovate in terms of finding solutions to everyday transportation needs for individuals and families, in connection with how they can make that bike more robust to fit those situations. Also, I noticed with equipment, for example, if you're biking in the winter, one of the things that you need to be concerned about is your feet, your hands.
Yeah, that's right.
So I assume that there's accessory products too that they've innovated with to help equip the biker to be able to deal with inclement weather.
Yeah. Again, one of the beauties is we sell to 5,000 bike shops across the country. And that means people riding in all kinds of climates. And especially being here in a cold weather state, again, our engineers turn their attention to how can we solve these problems of cold feet and cold hands. And that's when I mentioned earlier, we spawned a separate company called 45 North that has big boots, several different versions of boots that you can stay warm at 40 below zero.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Gloves that also keep your fingers warm, and so you can operate pogies, those big handlebar covers that go inside. And so I think what when you start riding a fat bike, what you realize is it's not so much you have to worry about the cold, you have to worry about overheating, because you are riding a bike, and riding on snow is harder. There's more rolling resistance. And so you start working pretty quickly, and the danger is that you're going to overheat because you're overdressed. And so you always hear about people dressing in layers. And so that's a big part of our sales in the apparel department is people realizing they need the right kind of coat. You can't just put on a pair of snowmobile boots and a huge thick parka because you'll die from heat. You have to have the right kind of clothes that even can adjust zippers and things to let airflow come in and that kind of thing. So it's wonderful to be part of a company that has the engineers who, it's different than in a big company where they set a price point and we're going to build a bike to this price point. At QBP, it's what kind of problems can we solve to make bicycling more accessible and safer and appeal to a broader audience.
You know, what's interesting is that when I used to bike to the university when I was 20 years old, University of Minnesota from my home, it was a harrowing experience oftentimes. Today it's just a pleasure. We have the Greenway in Minneapolis. We have a bike infrastructure that's set up that makes it actually very bike friendly. I know you've been a big part of that. I was wondering if you could explain more about
Sure.
how that has made a difference.
Well, first of all, I got involved very early on with mountain biking, and then and literally was not a commuter. I'm typical of the people who go 25, 30 years without riding a bicycle. The minute you get your driver's license, the bike sits, and then you switch. And then I discovered mountain biking, and mountain biking fit my fitness gene. It fit my gearhead gene. It was cool to do, and I lived out in Egan, and there was a trail right outside. And so unlike I'd been involved in motorcycles for years, but you had to put the motorcycle on a trailer and take it somewhere to ride. Here, I could just ride down the block and go on a mountain bike trail. And so I was just totally captivated by it. And then eventually I started racing right away, and realized if you want to really get in shape for racing mountain bikes, you have to spend time on a road bike. And so I ended up with a road bike, and then learned about the challenges of riding safely on a road, and then how actually limited I was in terms of, back in the early 90s, there just weren't that many bike lanes, or our societies just weren't equipped to deal with bicycling. And so I got involved with sort of the advocacy side of how can we get commuters to work in Minneapolis and St. Paul quickly and efficiently, and what is it going to take? Public pressure, political will, the right kind of funding, organizations that can lobby, that kind of thing. So I learned a great deal about that. I was fortunate in 1995, one of my very first efforts was to get the 3-foot rule passed. So when a car goes around a bicycle, it has to legally give you 3 feet. That was an organization I was working for called the Minnesota Coalition of Bicyclists back in 1995. So we got that 3-foot rule passed, and it showed me sort of that's the ultimate advocacy. If you can get laws passed to help your constituency, that's really what you need to do. And so that sort of launched my career, and then QBP recognized the kind of work that I was doing and asked me to create a position as a full-time bicycle advocate, and then come to work for the company in '98. And so I was the first person in the bicycle industry to be a full-time bicycle advocate. And that just led to so many opportunities, because I was literally the only person in the building who wasn't focused on parts or shipping or buying parts in Taiwan, getting sort of the nuts and bolts of the business. My job was outside the building, dealing with MnDOT and DNR and communities, and trying to figure out what do we have to do to move the meter to get more people buying bikes, and not just because we hope they would buy our bikes. It's just the right thing to do. The bicycle can solve so many of society's problems, but you have to have the right kind of infrastructure so that it can be done safely. The number one reason people don't ride bikes more is because they just don't feel safe. And so what can we do to make that difference? So really that's been one of my areas over the last 20 years, is to focus on that.
That's interesting. Where do you see innovation going with this? Do you see evolutions of bikes becoming sort of, I don't know, car-like, or I mean,
Yeah.
just the last year or two, all of a sudden I noticed people with the e-bikes just speeding by me, and a different demographic using those e-bikes that probably wouldn't have biked before.
Right.
Are there other things that you can see on the cusp of innovation that's going to create greater adoption?
Well, I think the rate of adoption, I think, is a function of people have to come to sort of an acceptance that no matter what they do, riding a bike is not going to be as easy or as powerful or travel distances as quickly as a car. And so you can't really compare the two. And I think what we're seeing here in the Twin Cities is people move here because of our bicycle infrastructure, and then they realize I can sort of recalibrate to have a different lifestyle where I don't have to rely on a car. And if I choose wisely in terms of what kind of work I do, where I shop, that kind of thing, they can really simplify their existence and commuters talk all the time about how they're able to get to work, not feel frazzled from stress, not be all worried about their congestion. They're saving a lot of money on cars and health club memberships, that kind of thing. They're getting their exercise as they go to work, and that I think that really bodes well. It's just more people need to understand that and how to do that, how to implement that.
Were you pivotal in also getting public transportation infrastructure to be compatible with biking?
Early on, I developed friendship with Congressman Jim Oberstar really early on. We became riding buddies, and he's not only was not only a great person, but he was a very powerful member of Congress. He was the ranking, what they call the ranking Democrat on the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, and so his whole life had been dedicated. His whole political life had been dedicated to improving the lives of the traveling public, whether it's by rail or air or by sea or anything. And so he was in a position to help decide what policies got implemented at a federal level and what got funded. And so when I realized this, I thought, boy, he's a guy that can help me not only help get our bicycle industry to understand the need to advocate, but he can actually help with individual programs here in Minnesota. And so that kind of tied in with the work that I was doing on behalf of Quality to get the rest of the bicycle industry to understand we need to have a political presence in D.C. And so it's all sort of connected. You need to have constituent organizations. You need to have politicians who get it and understand it. You need to have federal funding really to make widespread change. And fortunately, over the last 21 years, I've had basically free reign to do that. So it's been great.
Interesting. Peter, question with regard to PRT also. I'm sure software, for example, and computers have been a necessary part of the innovation associated with the development of PRT systems. Is there technological innovations on the horizon that are going to even more greatly advance the potential of PRT?
Yes, there certainly are. PRT today, let me say, when PRT came out 50 years ago in Morgantown, 45 years ago, that system's been running. That PRT system was kind of like a landline telephone. And PRT technology today is kind of like a flip phone. And where we're headed is PRT that's more like a smartphone. It's not just the technology and the increase in computing speed and communications and all those things that are moving ahead. It's also, as I said, the regulations are changing to be more compatible, but it's also our fundamental understanding of how the system could work and how it could function and how it could work better. And an example of that is reflected in the title of the technology. The name of the technology is Personal Rapid Transit, because it was envisioned as something that would be very personal. You would ride this vehicle by yourself, maybe share the ride with a friend or family, but probably not with a stranger. And so this is a very personal transportation system. Well, we've come to realize that whenever these systems are implemented, people share rides. They encourage others to get in. At Heathrow Airport, if people show up at the terminal station wanting to go to the parking lot, other people hold the door of the vehicle for them, just like you would an elevator door. So people naturally share rides. And when you get rid of that personal aspect, and to some extent, and share rides in the vehicle, all of a sudden it becomes much more economical. And that drives the cost down. When you drive the cost down, you can build more of it. It's easier to build and get started and so on. So sharing rides is a very important thing. I also think that socially it's an important thing. I think when people commute to and from work every day all by themselves in their car, I don't think that's good. When you get to see other members of the community and rub shoulders with them and possibly talk to them, I think that's really good. So I'm encouraged by that movement.
Someone shared with me a conceptual picture the other day that I thought was really interesting. It was one in which it showed a long, byway of cars going down probably like 5 or 6 blocks, just packed. And then they took the cars away and just showed the people.
Right.
And they took up
I've
so
seen
little
that.
space.
Yeah.
And then they sort of showed if we could bring all of those people together, we could put them all, into a very, very small, like, third of a block
Right.
concentration. And,
Right.
there's this perception that that there's so much,
Yeah, Alan, you asked a question earlier that I would like to answer, and that was
Sure.
just how much of the modern city is taken up by space for the automobile? And the answer is it's roughly 50%. If you count all the roads and all the driveways and all the parking lots and all the garages, and you add those up, and I've done it in the suburbs, and it's about 50%. It's unbelievable what that does in terms of driving us apart from each other, separating us from each other. The fact that many of the roads are congested, it's difficult to cross them. And then it adds to what do they call it? The heat island effect. It adds to stormwater runoff. It's just bad in every way.
There's a series of other things I thought about in association with that too, in that most of us who have cars, we may drive them somewhere and leave them idle for 23 out of 24 hours a day.
I think it's 96% of the day, the average car is idle. And the other thing is the average car needs 3 or 4 parking spaces. That's how many we have per car in every city. It's not 1 per car, it's 3 or 4.
And we produce, from what I understand, 60 to 70 million cars per year worldwide. And thinking about the amount of resources that are required to tap in order to support that habit is extraordinary.
It makes no sense at all.
We're going to take a break. We'll be back in 5 minutes. We'll continue with this conversation. Welcome back. We're joined by Peter Muller, President of PRT Consulting, and Gary Sjoquist, Advocacy Director for Quality Bicycle Products. So, in looking at automobiles, if we were to take a single automobile and say how many bikes could we make out of an automobile, how many bikes could we make with the same amount of material we'd use to produce a single car?
You could probably build a lot of bikes.
What about with PRT?
A PRT vehicle is a little more complicated than a golf cart. You've got an electric vehicle with four wheels, quite often with rubber tires running on a roadway, and weighing maybe somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds. But the point isn't so much the big difference in weight. The real point is that PRT vehicle will do 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 trips a day compared to a car doing 3 or 4. That's the big difference with PRT.
So basically, if it was possible to disengage the pedestrian from owning a car and having a wildly efficient mass transportation system combined with some sort of pedestrian transportation system, what would we could have a drastically different type of living environment. What could that environment look like if we had a world without cars?
We've done some looking into that, and you could have an environment where almost all of the significant, well, let me phrase that a different way. All of the motorized transportation, except maybe bike assist, okay, but all real motorized transportation could be above or below grade. And then the surface could be used for people walking, biking, wheelchairs, and things like that. And the extra space that you have that becomes available, you now have gained back maybe 40% of the 50%, or I should say most of the 50% that cars have used. And you could either use that to do infill housing or more buildings, or you could develop it as a more natural environment with people living in and working in what seems like a park, and yet they're in the middle of a dense city with close access to high-speed transportation and easy access to playgrounds for kids and places to walk and bike. It would just be, in my mind, close to utopia, but nobody seems to want to seriously do it. And part of that is because it's not easy to do. It's a big hurdle. And we can talk about that too.
Well, it seems like if you set up the infrastructure to be able to accommodate bikes and these alternative transportation methods like PRT, then it would be possible to eliminate that other infrastructure that exists to support that. Now, something interesting about lifestyle changes, even for myself, I'll just say, I felt tremendously dependent on cars in my 20s and 30s and 40s. Now I'm noticing that we have Uber and Lyft. We have a lot of infrastructure set up to support biking.
Mm-hmm.
You add in just this whole idea of having elevated transportation technology. Is it possible to envision a future that's carless? What would inhibit the potential for that occurring? What are the impediments that are there?
Well, I don't know about the impediments. I know that I personally got a glimpse of what something like that might look like last year. A presentation by a university professor talked about the impact of autonomous vehicles on existing infrastructure. So the visuals that he showed were just stunning. It was just, imagine, our 6 or 8 lane freeways where conceivably you could have 80% less vehicle traffic. And the vehicle traffic that was in use was autonomous. So they could run very close to each other. It'd be like Peter's PRT. It's not driverless, but so safety and everything. But anyway, the point is, instead of 6 or 8 lanes, you'd only need 2 lanes, or like out in our big suburbs where you have 6 or 8 lane intersections where if you're on a bicycle, you can see where you'd like to go. You just can't get there safely. It's just life-threatening with the number of traffic.
But the interesting part, though, is that with autonomous vehicles, we're talking about still road infrastructure that we'd be building with all of these new developments.
Right.
Now, with PRT, we're talking about the potential of not having the need for that road infrastructure in combination with a good pedestrian infrastructure.
Yeah.
So are these planners thinking the right way?
Well, just to expound on Gary's point, doing PRT safely at high speed and close headways on a closed environment, a protected environment of a dedicated elevated guideway is not easy. And I know a little bit about that. To say that driverless cars merging with each other at high speed on freeways is going to reduce headways even more and take up a lot less space is incredibly difficult, as all driverless cars are discovering. They're all postponing the date when they're going to go fully driverless. It's not that easy. And so while that may be possible, I don't think it'll be in our lifetimes. It's going to be 30, 40, 50 years off. And I don't want to restrict your lifetimes, but it's a long ways off. PRT, when elevated, takes up less than 1% of the area taken up by bus rapid transit, for example, the surface area. So it really does have the potential to free up most of the surface for other uses.
Well, and I think one of the cool things is that it frees up a lot of space for more bicycle infrastructure, wider lanes, bridges, that kind of thing, and more green space. Going back to this presentation, they showed a cross-section of what an intersection looks like now that's got, 3 or 4 lanes, a turn lane, a little grassy strip, compared to this kind of infrastructure. And to Peter's point, the presentation was, this is way in the future. So 40, 50, 60s, so many things have to happen. But it was just astonishing to see the kind of transformation that could take place where everywhere would be much, much more green space, dedicated travel lanes for bicycles and pedestrians or PRT or whatever. But then on the flip side, you're thinking, what would the costs be to dismantle all the existing parking ramps and highways or retrofit them toward what Peter's talking about? I
can talk to that. I'm a civil engineer, and I've been around pavements and pavement maintenance for most of my life, and I can tell you that the cost of maintaining our pavements is huge. And in fact, the American Society of Civil Engineers rates the state of our infrastructure for transportation, and I forget exactly where it is right now, but it's around about a D. It's mostly failed. We may as well just throw it away and recycle it and redevelop it. And so my point is that PRT gives us this ability to have this utopian future, which you were describing, your presenter indicated was 40, 50, 60 years in the future. We have that ability today, right now. We could start it tomorrow.
Well, but here's the question, and that is that automobiles, trucks, roadways for hauling things. Now, can a PRT car haul stuff?
Yeah, so I'd like to talk about that. What can cars do that PRT can't do? And certainly when you're looking at retrofitting an existing city, there's a lot of stuff that you're going to leave in the hands of cars and trucks and fire engines and things like that. But if you were to develop a new city starting from a clean sheet of paper, you can move almost everything that has to be moved by truck, including a grand piano, by PRT. if you think about ways that you could do this, you certainly could. You could get rid of fire engines. The firemen could arrive at the fire site by PRT, and buildings could be required to all be sprinkled, or things like that. There are things that you can do to mitigate or change the way we currently respond to emergencies and the way we deliver goods and so on. And I would submit that we could move, and I've done some preliminary analysis of this, we could move large freight like coal more effectively in PRT than we can in trains, because you have a much lighter infrastructure and you can use small vehicles and you can get them loaded and dispatched much more quickly, and they can run faster, and they wouldn't have to stop and start so much. It's just many things that you could do a lot better. Now, there's some aspects of freight, like the blades for a wind turbine, that you're never going to move on the PRT systems. You know, I'm never going to tow my camper up into the mountains with my PRT system. So there's always going to be some place for roads and cars and trucks and things like that. I don't think we'll ever entirely get rid of them, except in specific neighborhoods that are developed that way.
So we could greatly reduce our road infrastructure, but not completely eliminate it, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
What about, though, you know, I've heard about innovations with other things like drones, and I've heard about drone taxis. I've heard about, you know, I can't remember if it was Dubai that was talking about having that capability. I know the idea of something that's flying, carrying something, you know, of tremendous weight might not seem very realistic in one sense, but then again.
And I'm a private pilot too. I understand a little bit about flying. And I can tell you this, that as soon as you go to flying, you become much more weather dependent, and the system's going to be less reliable. When you are landing a helicopter or a drone, you cause all kinds of wind on the ground and dust and things like that. Managing millions of these vehicles flying in the airspace is not going to be all that easy. And then they've got to be totally autonomous too. It's all possible, but it's, I think, a long way out. And maybe we should be planning for that in the future. But if we're looking at the next 10, 20, 30 years, it's not going to be there, you know?
With bicycles, interestingly enough, I was thinking too, an impediment, but maybe it's not an impediment, is like, for example, with assist, if you have somebody whose health is not as strong, assist might be something that really would be really helpful for them. But there's also the positioning of a bicycle with the human body. I've seen some bicycles, recumbent bikes, that exist now. I don't know that those have always existed. I think they're another innovation where people sit back and they pedal forward. How do we deal with the different types of issues with people and person-powered transportation?
Well, it's a challenge. I know there's the overall sales of recumbent bikes in America is fairly low, and it tends to be aimed at people who have some kind of a disability, sore back, bad back, or whatever, or they just can't handle the upright, typical seating position on a bicycle. But it's also problematic in that you're low enough so that if you're trying to drive on a bike lane, for example, in the street, a motorist literally can't see you. I mean, you typically are below the top of the fender line. And so that's why most recumbent bikes will come with some kind of a long aerial thing with a little flag on it, so people exactly know what you were. And so it's very much a challenge for that. In terms of other kinds of innovations, the same guy here, Greg Olson, who developed rollerblades, came out with an elliptical bicycle. I see one running around down on Midtown Greenway every once in a while. But none of those really have caught on and been successful enough. You know, the key is, for better or for worse, we're in a capitalistic society, and companies have to make a profit on products. And at a place like QBP, we say, purpose before profit. We want to put money back into the things that make life easier and better for not only our employees, but our people too. But it's a challenge when somebody comes up with something completely new. And even the e-bike, I think e-bikes have had a tremendous time being accepted early on. It's getting better now. And I always tell people who are sort of anti-e-bike, think of yourself 20 years from now or 25 years from now when you have bad knees or a bad back or whatever, and you really like the bicycle, you enjoy it, you are dedicated to commuting. Maybe this extends your cycling ability 10 or 15 or 18 years. I don't know how you could quantify this, but I feel probably the great majority of people I see on e-bikes probably weren't riding regular bikes before. There's just something that opens up so many things for them by doing this. We hear that all the time in the bike industry. So.
Did you ever watch the Flintstones when you were a little kid?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
I remember how Fred's car, you'd see his feet moving underneath.
Yeah.
In some ways, I sometimes wonder, you see a bicycle built for two, two-person bicycle, they have one person in the back, one person at the front. And then you were talking about the innovations with QBP with that dummy bicycle that's real long and you can fit your kids in the back and you have saddlebags in the sides and you can commute around town. Is there the potential, or is anybody looking at innovations where you could literally have a family that's all pedaling at the same time? I've seen it with in downtown Minneapolis, you'll see people drinking beer and
those pedal pubs, which are a disaster, just waiting to happen. I don't know. I haven't seen anything like that. The challenge is it would have to be wide, and then you've got some steering issues and geometry. There's all kinds of things that tangle into it, and I think, again, for many of us in the bike industry, it's just like there's something like 54 million bikes that are hanging in garages all across the country. If we could just get some people to just start riding bikes, everything would get the size of the revenue for the bicycle industry would probably triple because all these people would need new bikes and work and all mechanical service, that kind of thing. But it's the march of technology takes over and people always seem to have a better idea. I would just like to see people get on bikes as a whole.
Well, what's fascinating though, just to think about, is that organizations, they say that put their mission around a product versus around a solution tend to be short-lived type organizations. The nature of what a bike was 30 years ago versus what a bike is today has changed. The nature of what PRT is for transportation is a step forward in terms of innovation with regard to transportation that we currently don't see commonplace today. But you could probably, when I look at it, I say to myself, inevitably, we're going to get there.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I used to watch the Jetsons cartoon. I don't know if did they play that in South Africa?
No, but I've seen them here.
Okay. Well, interestingly enough, in actually going into some different factories and things, I've seen some interesting technologies. Like, for example, with eggs, if you go into an egg processing facility, you'll see an egg be able to be transported out of a system carefully without breaking it. And with, for example, PRT, part of my thought in that too is there going to be a time like with the Jetsons where there's a person who's traveling forward in a vehicle and then is ejected over into their location as the vehicle keeps moving forward? And is that a next evolution that would occur beyond with PRT? And then thinking about that, looking forward and saying, okay, if we look at a car company today, a car company sees themselves as a car company is building their future around the product, whether it's autonomous vehicles or whatever that is. But maybe an automobile company needs to be thinking that it's moderate distance traveling for individuals. And whatever that technology is going to be for the future is where I need to go to address a human, planet-friendly solution. Same thing with bicycles or PRT. I mean, it's all, what is the solution that we're trying to drive towards? And on the other side, what are the things that are inhibiting the potential of that solution? Now, I know that in Minneapolis, at one point, probably 1930s, there was a massive infrastructure that had been set up for light rail that was all torn out. I hear there's some corruption that was responsible for some of that, associated with automobile companies not wanting us to become dependent on public transportation infrastructure. There's a political dynamic that is complicated, complex, and I'm thinking that when we come back, I'd like to discuss in this last segment how would we not only create adoption by the consumer for these new, options, but how do we overcome these impediments, these barriers to the transformation of our transportation infrastructure into these alternatives that are very much needed? So we'll be back in 5 minutes to discuss that. We suggest that our listeners take a 5-minute break also. All right, well, welcome back. We're joined by Peter Muller, President of PRT Consulting, and Gary Sjoquist, Advocacy Director for Quality Bicycle Products. Before we get into solutions, I just wanted to ask both of you to expound upon the idea of social impact of getting us away from cars and into alternatives like PRT and biking.
Well, I'll go first, Peter. I mentioned earlier about people recalibrating their lifestyles and trying to figure out to make it just easier to get around. And I think what we see is people realize both economic and social benefits. I mentioned earlier, people who figure out and are able to solve the issues around riding a bike to work on a regular basis, that they inevitably get leaner, healthier, stronger, and they often talk about their reduced costs to live. They're not tied up a lot of money. If they have a car, they only use it to go away long distances, much like in Europe. And so very often there's a sense of well-being, and people have less stress in their lives. We find many people who hear about that and think, that'd be great, but I have to wear a suit at work, or I have no place to shower, or whatever. And so I think what you find is, people figure it out. Every day in Minneapolis, more than 7,500 people ride bicycles into work. And in many cases, workplaces have learned that we need to accommodate these people by providing showers or incentive programs or places to park their bike, indoor secure parking, that kind of thing. Maybe a little shop to work on it. We actually host a quarterly forum for businesses to get together and talk about, okay, Target, what are you doing to have something that's healthy and as beneficial for your employees as riding a bike to work? And so they learn from each other about where they are. But it's a very personal. It comes down to you're going to have to make sacrifices.
So from a mental health standpoint, though, we talk about we look at today and we say, okay, we have these social networks upon which we can go onto Facebook and we can have 1,000 friends that we never see. And there's big mental health issues associated with loneliness, from what I understand today. I've noticed that since I've been biking, just as an example, there's a whole community of people that I've gotten to know that are bikers.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm biking somewhere, oftentimes somebody will bike up right alongside of me and say hello.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That sort of thing doesn't happen when you're in your car.
No, it's true. That's true.
And so there is a socialization aspect of biking itself in bringing people together. People can actually see each other rather than seeing a car pass by them. Has that been something that also is something that's factored into by Quality Bicycle Products, or in your efforts in politics and so on and so forth, in addressing the social health, the mental health issues associated with?
Oh yeah, we
these types of
everything from at the federal level, trying to get a bicycle commuter benefit, an act actually in place so that you would get a tax break if you ride your bike to work, all the way down to just actually linking people together at QBP when we're a bike company, right? So we don't want people golfing, we want people biking. And so we really push the idea of incentivizing so that people can ride their bike to work and make it easy. But then we take another step and actually created a commuter league in which teams actually compete against each other. And it's based on how many trips you make during a week. And what we find is it capitalizes on two things, competition and loyalty. Okay, so from a competitive sense, we have these mild-mannered accountants who are talking trash to some of our hardcore commuters, talking about how they're going to beat them this week in the commuter league. And then loyalty is, if it's raining and you get up in the morning and your team is counting on you to get in there, they do that. And so we find that, again, the socialization of this makes it easier to do. You can relate to other people who have solved these problems already, and it gives you a tribe, I guess, to belong to. And we think that's good. We think that's a good thing. So I try and help create, mountain biking communities. That basically, that's what our high school mountain bike league is. It's this tribe that's centered around mountain biking, and it's wonderful in the sense that for especially teenage girls, being part of a team and being strong and physically fit and learning skills on a bike helps as in terms of kind of an antidote to beauty and gender norms that are so challenging for teenage girls. We have autistic kids who ride, who, for parents, their whole life has been quite a challenge. And here's a kid who wears a jersey, is accepted by his team, competes, is given a, if he even does a lap, he gets a medal put around his neck. It's just wonderful to see that, bicycling in many different forms can provide these kinds of changes.
Or like trips for kids that you have pioneered, bringing inner city kids together in a healthy way as a community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for many of these kids, it's a concrete jungle where they live. And, the idea of, I remember we had a kid, I launched it in 2006 and over the summer we'd have a couple hundred inner city kids that would get a chance to come out and ride the trail by the Minnesota River, where you'd see these beautiful flowers. One week it's all blue flowers, next week it's yellow and there's butterflies. And I had to work really hard to talk a kid out of taking a turtle home because he had actually never seen a real turtle and he just wanted to bring it home. And it's like, that's not going to work. So sorry, but that's what's cool about, exposing people to new experiences, new other people, and learning a little bit about how, we talk about you're on this mountain bike trail along the river, and 200 years ago, there were probably Native Americans that were using this very same trail. They look out on the river and they see barges going up and down with grain or whatever. Mm-hmm. So you get to talk about that. So it really can be, the bike is a mechanism to open up the world for these people. I think that's a pretty cool thing.
And makes us slow down so we can actually see it.
Yeah.
And Peter, you were talking before too about PRT being something that can be shared vehicles where you can be bringing community together also through that. So in essence, there are a whole series of positive social impacts that can be facilitated through this.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just bringing people together and having them intermingle a little bit more than they do in their drive to work. What we're talking about here is providing reliable, fast mobility to everybody. And the automobile doesn't do that. I don't know if you realize, but there is about a third of the community that either doesn't have access to a car or can't drive because they're too young, they're too old.
Good point.
Yeah.
Or they're disabled. And PRT takes that away potentially. I mean, a toddler of 2 or 3 is not going to ride a PRT vehicle, but a kid who's going to elementary school that's 4 or 5 certainly could. And you could set it up in such a way that the mother can monitor the trip the whole way and make sure the kid does get to school okay. And that in that case, that ride is not shared with strangers. Maybe it's shared with other kids, but any PRT passengers are always going to be CCTV monitored. And so you can monitor things to make sure that kids aren't bullying each other and things like that. Although in some cases, I personally think many parents are too much helicopter parents and they don't allow their kids to be harassed and they don't allow their kids to figure out and fight their own battles and stand up for themselves. And we might be raising a fragile society, but that's a whole nother issue. But so what we're talking about here is providing quick, inexpensive, reliable mobility for everybody. And this means being able to get to work, being able to take a job on the other side of town, which in many cities in the world, you can't do that. And in many places, even in America, you might have a 20-minute commute to work that on most days takes you an hour and a half, and you never really know whether it's going to be 20 minutes today or an hour today. And so how do you live a life like that? I don't understand how people put up with commutes like that. I'm on my way to Africa tomorrow, and I'm going to a city where the average person who catches the bus walks on average 35 minutes to the bus stop. When they get there, even if a bus comes immediately and they get on board, the bus will often sit there for half an hour waiting to fill up. So these people can spend over an hour of their commute before they've even started moving in a bus. And that's just terrible. How can people live like that? How can the economy withstand that kind of lack of mobility? Those are the kinds of things that PRT can solve, and solve rapidly, as I said before, for many times for no cost to the community.
That's fascinating. So basically, if we were able to create a pedestrian-friendly environment, which bikes, I believe, would play a huge role in that. On the other side, we were able to set up, a broad spectrum PRT infrastructure. We might, for the most part, be able to eliminate maybe 80 to 90% of the need for cars and actually improve the quality of life for everyone there, create transportation options for people that didn't have those options before, increase our park space.
Reduce emissions.
Yeah, air pollution.
Have no congestion. That's something else about PRT that people don't appreciate is, unlike a road or a train, the PRT guideway is very well suited to support solar panels. And if you put solar panels on the top of a PRT guideway that are roughly between 1 meter and 2 meter wide, the whole length of the guideway, in most areas of the world, that will generate enough electricity to power the whole system. So now you've got no fossil fuel use at all.
Carbon neutral.
Wow.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So,
yeah.
So what is it going to take to, in essence, transform our world into a world that can stretch resources and support us, an expanded population and living a better quality of life through developing this type of infrastructure?
Well, I think what it takes is people experiencing a lot of pain and recognizing that we're headed to a place that if we don't do anything different, there's going to be a lot more pain.
But do we need to wait until the pain occurs in order for change to happen?
Well, unfortunately, I would say yes. PRT's been around for 45 years, and we haven't had enough pain to overcome the disaster that it was in the beginning and look at the success it's become. And that's only turning around now. The problem with PRT as opposed to a bike is that you can sell a bike to a person. We can't sell a PRT car to a person. It's no use without the infrastructure. So the big problem with PRT is it requires its own infrastructure. The big advantage of PRT is that it has its own infrastructure. So it needs the government or large organizations to buy it.
But on the other side, though, doesn't there need to be a broader infrastructure to really make bikes viable also? That you don't have control over? I mean, you can sell a bike, but if you don't have the infrastructure to support it, it's not.
Yeah, people need to feel safe or
and isn't that what you do?
Yeah, try and help communities. I tell people in communities all across the country, you may not realize it, and typically this goes to mayor and city council people, you're in a competition with other communities because people these days can decide to live wherever they want. I mean, you don't necessarily need to be tied to a location to earn your living. You don't have to actually drive there, right? So, and you tie that into, something like 85% of millennials, according to surveys, don't want to be tied to a car. They want to live in places where there's walking or public transit or bicycling easily to get to school or shops or bars or concerts or whatever. And so that's one of the reasons I think a lot of communities are now deciding to, the sort of golden faucet of federal funding got turned off for a while at the congressional level. And so communities are funding this themselves, actually taxing their own communities to be able to do this kind of a build out because they realize this is our best and brightest might be leaving instead of staying here and starting new companies and investing and starting their families. And so it's kind of cool to see that transformation taking place. Another point I want to make about Peter is I've learned over the years that it's absolutely wonderful when you can show a changed paradigm to the right people. In the mid-2000s, I couldn't get a small community up north to understand what mountain biking could bring to them in terms of economic development. And finally, I just loaded all of them up into a 15-passenger van, and I drove them 2 hours over to northern Wisconsin, where this had been going on for a long time. And so a realtor was able to talk to another realtor to say, if I have a mountain bike trail and I'm trying to sell a house next to it, it's an automatic $5 or $6 grand more. A restaurant guy was able to say, I'm packed here every night with people who want beer and pizzas, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. We did the same thing in trying to get people to understand the value of bike lanes and the sort of integration of a system so you can really get it all the way around. And at the People for Bikes level, we used to take people over to Amsterdam, a group of 15 or 18 people. In 2010, I took the mayor of Madison, Wisconsin, and a bunch of his staff people, a bunch of university people, and put them on bikes to drive through Amsterdam and Utrecht, and then we did 2 days in Munster, Germany. And the mayor of Madison, the second day after that, stood up and said, I get it. Now I get it. I'm going to commit $2 million more to infrastructure for bicycling and pedestrian in Madison.
Well, let me ask you this, and that is that what if someone like yourself partnered up with somebody like Peter, and you put together a joint plan associated with the different pieces that would fill in the gaps for that infrastructure? Has that been commonly done to educate people about how you could, for example, marry, a pedestrian highway with a PRT infrastructure to create an overall solution?
Yeah, I think back to 2005 when Congressman Oberstar was pushing an idea. He wanted to give $25 million to 4 different communities in the United States to actually demonstrate how do you get people out of cars and onto bikes. And so we helped steer that into Minneapolis, and the result was like 66 miles of on-street lanes and 29 miles of bicycle boulevards and a 60% increase in bicycling and a decline in fatalities. So it really works. And that was $25 million that came from federal funding. But if you could get a federal grant of $25 or $30 million to actually build out a structure that has PRT and bicycling in the kind of areas that we're talking about, where there's thought into, okay, how is this actually going to work? And you see this in Germany and in Amsterdam, where land use planning goes into how are we going to get people around? And so I think a project like that could open a lot of eyes. People would see it and understand, oh, this is how it works. This could actually be done. I think you'd get a sea change, I think, after that.
Peter, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. You're trying to get people to understand how bicycles can really work to their advantage when all of the people you're talking to were raised around and with bicycles, and probably just about every one of them knows how to ride a bicycle. Yeah. Whereas I'm trying to explain the same thing to people who have no clue what
they need to see it.
In a lot of ways, understanding how PRT works and what its pros and cons are is actually quite complicated for the person who wants to implement it. It's not complicated for the person who wants to use it. That's very easy.
Yeah.
But when you want to buy it and implement it, it's not simple. So it's difficult. And any help we can get, we'd love to work with you on something like that. Sure.
It's interesting to think about just this idea of when we're moving in our own silo towards our own solutions. The truth is that the true solution is going to require a merging of several silos.
Yeah.
Right? And the other side is this. It's interesting when you were talking about Jim Oberstar and how he was not only interested in working with you, but he actually went on rides with you and things like that. There are politicians out there that do want to find solutions.
Oh, yeah.
And I think there's the issue of lack of awareness, but I wonder the extent to which strategic partnerships, like the potential that both of you could bring together with each other, could end up fostering ideas on how government could experiment to drive forward with solutions.
Yeah, the current chair of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee is an old bike mechanic named Peter DeFazio. And so he is really driving what will be the next federal transportation authorization sometime in 2020 or 221. And he is determined that there will be more funding and policy for bicycling and climate change. And so he would be the kind of person that you could go to and say, how about if we did a demonstration project for this, and then you set up the parameters and that kind of thing. But that's what that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a large chunk of money, and it's got to be a collaborative effort in some place where there can be a demonstrated difference that people can actually visit and it works, and the demonstration won't end halfway with a PRT car that's not going to make it or a bike that's going to break down. It has to be successful, and people have to see that it's going to work, and then that little light goes on that says we can do this. We can do this.
Because it seems like there's tremendous benefit to the communities within which this type of infrastructure is developed, and there's tremendous environmental benefits as well. You had mentioned before, Peter, about, or at least in our private discussions, about Morgantown, West Virginia, where back in the early 70s or mid 70s, they initially put in place a PRT system where there were some errors that occurred that took things in not the greatest direction publicly in terms of support. But today, though, evidently that infrastructure works very well, right?
Yes, it works. It works phenomenally well. Actually, it was starting to work not so well a few years ago, and that was because the computer control system was getting way out of date. And they recently upgraded that computer control system, and it's now back to working the way it should. So it does work well. Also, modern PRT deployments, and I mentioned earlier, there's been deployments in places like England, Holland, South Korea, United Arab Emirates. Modern deployments have all gone out, I won't say without a hiccup, but without a major hiccup. None of them have had a major cost overrun or a major bust in the schedule or anything like that. So the technology's out there, it works, it runs, there are no problems with it. It just needs to be implemented on a larger scale.
Okay. Well, this has been a really interesting discussion. Thank you both for joining us. And I hope that the formulation of solutions towards the health, harmony, and security of the world continues as a result of our conversation.
I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you.